Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Flawless Execution webinar. I'm Ansley Ankers, and I'll be here to answer any questions and provide technical support throughout the presentation. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to you by email. The presentation slides will be available following the webinar on Afterburner's SlideShare. At the end of the presentation, we will open up for live Q&A. I will be monitoring the chat and Q&A box on your screen where you can submit questions at any time during the presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Finch.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ansley, and thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. I want to repeat what Ansley said. If you have any questions or comments along the way, type them in that chat box there or the Q&A box, and we're going to set aside time at the end of the program to make sure that we address those. Hey, today's program is all about you. It's all about the individual. So for the last 22 years, Afterburner has been teaching the processes and tools of flawless execution, or what we call Flex, to thousands of organizations. Almost 2 million people we've taught this process to now. And one of the things I've always wanted to do, and that sometimes we have an occasion to do, and that we're going to focus on today, is applying that methodology to you as an individual. That's why we call it Flex Your Muscles. How flawless execution can help you achieve your individual goals, and it can also help you achieve your professional development goals as well. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we go. So real quick about me, I've met many of you before, but if not, here's about my background. I live up in Billings, Montana. I was just telling Ansley a little bit ago about all the snow we got on the ground, but the sun's out, so I'm hoping some of it melts today. My call sign is Finch. I've been going by Finch for about 15 years. I went to the Air Force Academy, and I also flew the F-16 on active duty. Served as an Air Force One advanced agent for a number of years, working with the Air Force One crew and with the White House staff. A nonprofit, I founded a nonprofit food bank down in Del Rio, Texas, about 8 years ago, and we provided a lot of meals to families in need on this little border town that really had a need for food and for somebody to step up and help the lower advantaged people in the community. Joined Afterburner about 4 years ago, and I've been promoted to a partner at Afterburner just recently, so something I'm really proud of. I'm really excited to welcome our guest today. His name's Will Duke. We call him Q. He's at the home office, and the reason that we gave Q this call sign is because he's kind of like the guy in the James Bond movies, right? You guys all know Q from the James Bond movies. His job was to provide James Bond with all the tools that he would need to use as a secret spy, giving him like the laser pen or the disappearing car. Well, Q's job is to help us out by providing us with the tools and the resources that allow us to be successful. So Q actually was in the Navy for 23 years as a surface repair officer. After he left the Navy, he spent 8 years, Fortune 500. Working in ops management and hiring and training. And then for the last 10 years, he's been the director of learning and development at Afterburner. And what that really means is Will's kind of like the brain trust. He's the brains behind the operation. And one of the responsibilities Will has for us is he reads as many books on business and professional development as possible, about leadership training, everything, anything he can get his hands on, he reads that. And then what he does is he drafts up book reviews and shares those across the organization so that we all get a little bit better. So we don't usually let him out of his cubicle, but today we're going to make an exception. We're going to let him come out and actually speak to you guys. So Will, thank you so much for joining us today. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Always looking forward to opportunities like this, especially to work with you, Finch, and buttering you up a little bit.
All right. You're on the right track. Thank you, sir. All right. So for those of you that don't know, our methodology is called flawless execution. And that's not just a cool saying, although flawless execution is a really cool saying. Flawless execution is actually a methodology or a process, or really, in the case that we're going to discuss today, a way of life. It's a method that was born and bred in a zero tolerance for error world of combat aviation. And it's a process that's simple, scalable, it's repeatable. It's the same process that we use as fighter pilots, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, Army Rangers, surface warfare officers like you. The process that we use to drive daily, weekly, monthly, even quarterly results. All right, but today we're going to tailor it to the needs of you as an individual. So specifically what we're going to focus on There's a lot of different components of the flawless execution model, but today we're going to focus on the heart of it, called the flawless execution cycle. It's an iterative cycle, right? So before we'd ever go out on a mission, me and my team would get together and we'd plan out exactly what we wanted to accomplish. We'd be collaborative, we'd work together in developing our plan of execution. Then, as the leader, I'd stand up in front of my team and I'd brief my team on what my expectations are, what they're accountable for, making sure that my team's aligned before we go out the door. And then the next thing we do is it's time to go out and execute. Execute on the mission that we've just created together. And along the way, we're trying to mitigate something called task saturation. So task saturation is a real bad thing. It's the perception or the reality of having too much to do and not enough time, tools, or resources to get the job done. Well, we've all been in that position before. And when we find ourselves in that position, we have to have tools to mitigate that. And that's one of the things we really focus on teaching at Afterburner. So after we've planned our mission, we brief it, we go out and execute it. What's unique about our program is after everything we do, every mission, every project, every task, we get together and we debrief with the sole intent of creating lessons learned, little actionable steps that will allow us to be more successful as we move forward into the future. Today we're really going to focus on the first of those four steps. We're going to focus on mission planning and how that can apply to you as an individual. So there's 6 steps to mission planning. We're going to go through each of these. And the methodology that we're going to use, I'm going to do just a little bit of instruction about each step. And then Will's going to tell us the story about how he privately used these 6 steps to identify a project that he wanted to undertake and how he designed the plan for how he was going to go out and execute it. But before then, let's talk about why we should even plan in the first place. Here's the cold hard facts. We've worked with a lot of different organizations. Most companies don't really plan. And you're probably nodding your head on the other end of this webinar saying, yeah, you're right. We don't really plan. Every now and then we'll do like a quarterly plan or maybe an annual plan or something like that. But we don't really plan. But planning is an incredibly valuable tool for organizations. It's also an incredibly valuable tool for individuals to use, and I'll explain why throughout the webinar. But the reason that we really want to plan is we want to set a stake in the ground at a point in the future, right? We want to establish the finish line and where we want to be so that we can work backwards in our planning process and figure out the steps it's going to take to get there. You see, we want to go into our actions in our organization and as individuals, and we want to be proactive with our actions, right? We don't want to be reactive. And unfortunately, so many of us are reactive. We sit back, we wait for life to happen to us, we wait for life the real world to slap us around in the face, and then we just react to it. Well, what we're trying to teach you today is you don't have to sit back and wait for life to happen. You can make life happen by having an accountable plan that you can develop using our 6 steps of mission planning. Now, there's a lot of other benefits to planning as well. One of the concepts that we strongly promote within your organization or in your family or on your team is that you commit to a concept of open planning. We don't want one person to come up with a plan, kind of in their own little world. We want to get everybody involved, right? We want to bring in our whole team, and we want to ask them questions about, hey, what are the threats you see? What actions can you be accountable for? What could be our biggest contingency? Right? We want their buy-in. This is a very collaborative effort. And when we do this, when we engage in open planning, you're going to see 3 different outcomes from that process. The first thing that you're going to see, most obviously, is you're going to have a team that's super aligned, right? Everybody, when they walk out of the room, will understand what the plan is and where we're going and why we're even doing it. The next thing you'll see, and this is probably a little bit more obvious, is your team's going to be accountable. They're going to have looked you in the eyes as the leader or as a team member and say, yes, I will hold myself accountable to accomplishing this task by this date. And the third one, and you probably wouldn't have guessed this, but most teams that commit to a concept of open planning and collaboration are more motivated. Right? Your team's going to be motivated to go out and accomplish a plan that they worked on and something that they actually own instead of we're just given a plan and told to go out and execute it. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about Will's story. So the very first thing that we do when we plan is we determine our mission objective. So notice I did not say a mission statement. This is not some vague characteristic of, hey, we're going to go out there and do our best, right? We avoid that to the utmost. In our world, we have to have a mission objective. This is a laser-focused statement. In fact, in our world, for a mission objective to even be considered viable, it has to meet 4 criteria. It has to be clear, which means you and everybody else participating must understand what we're trying to accomplish. It has to be measurable. That means there has to be some sort of quantification. If it can't be measured, how do you know if we're successful or not? It has to be achievable, which means everybody that's participating has to say, yes, this is something we can do. And then finally, it has to be aligned with your high definition destination. And I know we skipped over that, but essentially that's saying, is this aligned with where we see ourselves in the future? Whether that's organizationally, does this align with the vision we have for ourselves in the future? Or as an individual, do the actions I'm taking today align with my personal goals? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will. And Will, why don't you give us a little bit of context about the mission objective that you worked out for you and your family?
All right, thanks, Finch. And I've been doing this and applying flawless execution for over a decade. Really, the principles for much, much longer than that, but formally flawless execution for about a decade. And I'm the father of 2. At the time that we developed the mission I'm going to share with you, my kids were 10 and 11 years old. And every year, either once or twice a year, we plan a family vacation. We try to do something new and different each time, not just go to Disney World. So a couple of years ago, we decided we wanted to go to Yellowstone National Park. Now, it just so happened that in 2016, when we did this, it was the 50-year anniversary of the park. So with the limited time and availability that I had and the school vacations that my kids had, we decided that we needed to do this in July of that year. So our formal mission objective, and remember, like Finch said, a mission objective has to be clear, measurable, achievable, and aligned with your future HDD, right? So ours was to travel to Yellowstone National Park via airline to Bozeman, Montana for a 4-day and 3-night adventure from July 5th to July 8th of 2016. So that's the mission objective that I was operating with my kids.
Real quick, Will, though, is this the final mission objective that you had, or did you start with something different?
Well, that's a great question because no. As you can possibly imagine, when you're trying to come up with family vacations with your kids, it starts out with something very simple like, hey, let's go to Yellowstone this year. For example, this year we've decided to go to Chicago, probably sometime in the fall. So right now our mission objective is not clear, measurable, achievable, or necessarily aligned. Our mission objective at this point is just let's go to Chicago sometime. Well, that's not enough. We've got to build and refine that mission objective before we begin to plan the details.
Got it. All right. So you've got this very clear mission objective. And the next step in the mission planning process is we identify the threats. So threats are those things that are going to stand in the way of you achieving your personal mission objective. These are the things, the roadblocks that you have to figure out how to overcome. And we try to identify those in the planning phase instead of waiting till we're actually at Yellowstone Park and figure it out the hard way, right? So, Will, what are some of the threats you came up with while you were preparing for this trip?
Well, for anyone on this webinar that are children, plural, or parents of children, plural, you might have a similar experience as I do. My 2 are very close in age, and they fight and complain all the time when they travel. So this drives me up the wall. I'm not going to have a great adventure. I'm not going to have a lot of fun if my kids are fighting and complaining. So that was threat number 1 to me. 2, it's expensive to travel to Yellowstone. Well, mainly because I live in Atlanta, unlike Finch, who lives less than an hour from the park himself. The main thing, and I alluded to this in the mission objective, was this was not just a busy time of year for Yellowstone. The 2016, the week that I went, which was the week of the 4th of July Independence Day holiday, has been recorded as the busiest tourist season the park has ever seen. Oops. That is going to interfere with my joy because I don't like crowds. So that was a big one to overcome. I had never been. In all my life, at the time, I was in my late 40s when I planned this, and it was my first trip as well as my kids' first trip to Yellowstone. So we didn't have any firsthand knowledge or experience about it. And finally, we didn't really know what we needed to take. Going to Yellowstone is a trip into the wilderness. We didn't know what kind of gear we were going to need to pack, and that could impinge upon our joy and enjoyment of the park itself. Now, that's just 5 threats, and the rule of thumb that we recommend is to focus on just about 5 top threats. It doesn't mean you can't have 6 or that you can't have 4, but getting too much into the details of smaller and minor threats isn't usually that necessary in the planning process. So we just recommend stick to the 5 or so top threats.
Awesome. So Will has just introduced to us his top threats. So the next step that we have to take when we plan out a mission is we identify our available resources. What are the things that we have at our disposal right now that are going to help us either overcome those threats or achieve the specific mission objective? So let's take a look at some of Will's resources.
All right, thanks, Finch. So for me, I travel a bit, not as much as Finch does, but I travel enough to have a lot of sky miles or airline points. I have a lot of hotel points, and I had a lot of car rental points. So that was a huge resource in defraying the costs of the adventure itself. So for us, that was a really important thing that really addressed our enjoyment and didn't hurt my wallet as much as I expected. By the way, we pulled this vacation off for about $1,000 all total. And if anybody has any more questions or more experiences they'd like to hear about this because they want to plan a Yellowstone vacation, I'm happy to share my knowledge with you. Fourth thing is there are some wonderful web resources, many of which are put out by the park itself to help you plan your trip. I don't know what I would have done without these. These are some wonderful programs that you can download PDFs and help you plan the details of your adventure. And finally, my kids and I were really excited. We had a lot of enthusiasm about going into this. So my hope was this would defray some of the whining, crying, complaining, and fighting that my kids are prone to. But let me give you a warning about this. Many of my resources were more directed at negating the threats that I outlined. That's just the way mine happened to be, but that is not the principal objective of identifying your available resources. That's because you want to look at the resources that are going to help you achieve your objective primarily, not just get focused on negating threats. It's okay for them to negate the threats. That should not be your primary objective when you're outlining your top resources. So back over to you, Finch.
Awesome. So we've identified the mission objective. We've talked about the threats, what's going to stand in the way of Will and his family getting there, or the potential fights that would ruin the whole trip, right? We've talked about his available resources, and now finally we get to the step where we evaluate lessons learned. So in a perfect world, if this was within your organization, you would get your lessons learned from previous debriefs, like I just said a little bit ago. You would generate the lessons learned from a previous experience, and you'd share it back within your team or across the organization. But sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you don't have previous debriefs available to you. Sometimes you got to reach out to someone with more experience on what you've done before. Or maybe you've done something similar in the past and you can rely on your own lessons learned. So, well, what were some of the lessons learned that you identified during your planning?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, it just so happens that I know a guy. His name's like Finch or something, that happens to live near Yellowstone and has been a few times in his life. So probably has some relevant experience in how to make this the best experience for myself and my kids. So the first thing I did was I called Finch and said, Finch, what can you tell me about going to Yellowstone? And he gave me some pure gold that really was absolutely critical to making this the great positive experience that we actually had in the end. And one thing he told me was get there early. And that's because people tend to start flowing into the park in the morning and they flow out in the afternoon. So the crowds are at the gates early in the morning and they're dispersing early or late in the afternoon. So get there early. Got it. The other thing he said was to fly and stay in Bozeman, Montana rather than Billings because he had experience there. And he said Bozeman, but the funny thing is Finch lives in Billings. So I'm not sure if he wasn't accommodating to me. Maybe he didn't want me around, but he didn't invite me to stay at his place to defray some more of my costs. But he and I will talk about that later. Anyway, we flew into Bozeman, and we really enjoyed that. We got a hotel there the first night and planned to move or to travel into the park that next morning. That was a great idea. It also told us to, and this was the most important part of the lessons learned. Finch told us to spend the night at the Old Faithful Inn inside the park. And if you're not familiar with the park, the Old Faithful Inn is more towards the middle of the park, the northern middle part of the park. So if you stay in there, most of the crowds disperse during the day and go to hotels outside the park. So guess what? We actually experienced almost being alone and having the park to ourselves for the most part of our stay. It was absolutely wonderful. And finally, create a detailed agenda. You got to leave room for some downtime and some buffer room so that when the kids say, hey, Dad, let's go do that, you have time in your schedule to go do it. So you don't want to overplan. You don't want to underplan. Make sure you've got some fluff in your agenda. That was some great stuff Finch gave us. So back over to you, Finch.
Awesome. Will, my door is always open to you.
Sure. Just say that now.
All right, so we've got Will's lessons learned, which I was happy to share with him because I did grow up next to Yale, so I've been there a few times. But now that we've taken all of this data, we've determined our objective, we took all the data from the threats, the resources, and the lessons learned, it's finally time to come up with our battle plan, our course of action. This is a step-by-step guide for who will do what by when to make sure that we get the job done. Now, most of the time when you've planned in the past, I bet most of the time when you plan in the past, someone's given you a project and said, you need to get this done, and you said, all right, step 1 is this, step 2 is this. And you skip over all this other part where you identify the threats, the resources, and talk about lessons learned. Well, really, we're trying to get you to start thinking about, let's do a little bit of a risk analysis. Let's talk about what tools we need, before we start putting pen to paper and coming up with the plan. So, Will, let's talk real quick about your course of action, your battle plan.
All right, Finch. So what we're showing you on the screen now is just a piece, a few of the fragments of the course of action. It was several pages long because, again, I was detailing over the span of this 3.5 days where we were going to be every few hours, where we planned to be, with enough room between those points to give us some opportunities to change and adapt the schedule. One of the things that I wanted to point out in this particular example is, first of all, I included my kids in the planning process. So I would pitch things and be like, what do you think about going here? What do you think about going there? And that built enthusiasm on their part so they could anticipate and build the excitement of actually going on the trip. So that's an important thing to make sure you do if this is a plan that includes more than just yourself. The other thing was, right there in the middle, it says, acquire bear spray. So everything went really well on our plan except for acquire bear spray. And everything I read told me I needed to buy bear spray before we got to the park. So I put that on the plan, and we did that before we got in the park. And lo and behold, when we actually got inside the park, we found a number of places where you could rent bear spray. So I spent money on bear spray when I didn't really need it. So we made note of that, and that is a lesson learned that I can, in turn, pass on to other people. So now my lesson is, don't buy the bear spray, just rent it when you get in the park. So other than that, it turned out great. We had a great experience, and we followed our timeline pretty much the way it was laid out within about 30 minutes to an hour from point to point. So it was great. Oh, back over to you, Finch.
All right, so we've got the bear spray, ready to go out and execute on the plan, right? But there's one last thing that you need to take into consideration, right, Will? And that's that you have to plan for contingencies. And anytime you uproot your family from Atlanta, fly them all the way to Montana, I guarantee there's going to be something that does not go according to plan. So you want to be prepared for that, right? You want to be proactive with your actions when those things don't go according to plan, instead of reacting to them when they actually happen real time. So what was your contingency plan for this planning session?
Well, when we looked at the plan itself, we realized that because of the course that we were going to take through the park over several days and back to Bozeman, that there was a real possibility we might get out of the park a little bit early and wind up in Bozeman earlier than we expected. So I set up a contingency plan with what are we going to do if we get to Bozeman too early, how are we going to fill the afternoon? And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So I had pre-planned that if we had gotten to Bozeman before 4 p.m. on the third day, that we were going to go to the Museum of the Rockies, which is awesome, by the way. So again, we planned for a contingency so that even when something kind of went a little bit wrong, we still had a great time doing it. And the proof is that my daughter, after seeing all the Tyrannosaurus Rex exhibits, she decided she wanted to be a paleontologist. Now, she's changed her mind 3 times since then, but that's beside the point. She was very excited about it. So all in all, the plan worked out well, and contingencies was a really essential part of it.
Well, that's great. And that's actually a picture of her standing in front of the world's largest T-Rex skull, which happens to be from my home state of Montana, just bragging a little bit. They probably had to dig it out of a bunch of snow first to get to it, but that's all right. So, Will, thank you for sharing that plan. That was fantastic. It's a good example of how you can use this, with your family to go out and achieve success. But in the title of the webinar, I said, what about an individual goal? What if you want to set an individual goal? How can you go out and be successful? Well, man, there are millions and millions of individual goals that you can set for yourself. But I want to tell a story about a client of Afterburners and how they applied this methodology to their personal life. So we had a client maybe 3 years ago now, and we had a real great day with this organization. Taught them a lot, and we had a great discussion. And following that, one of the members of their team actually reached out to a member of Afterburner, one of our facilitators, Joel Thornton. He's actually the president of the company now. And so Thor, if you don't follow him on LinkedIn or know much about him, he's very into fitness. He's a very physically fit guy, Ironman, and does all sorts of physical activity, stuff like that. So this guy reached out to Thor and said, Thor, I'm a little bit above my fighting weight. I feel like I'm out of shape. I want to get back to being healthy. And in fact, my goal is to get down below 200 pounds. So that's kind of how we said it. Thor sat down with him and worked through the methodology. And the first thing he said to him is, we got to get more specific on this mission objective. You want to be less than 200 pounds? Tell me the day that you're going to have that done by. So this gentleman, he committed to being below 200 pounds. And when they started out on this journey together, this is what the scale looked like. All right, so that's hovering right around 248-ish pounds. It looks like. Let's round it up, call it 250. He's at 250 pounds. And he set a date in the future and said, I will be below 200 pounds on that date. And between him and Thor, they went through the threats, the resources. They came up with a plan, and Thor helped him remain accountable throughout the execution of that plan. And on the last day, on the day it was due, he texted this picture to Thor. Hold on a second. This picture right there to Thor. Just a hair under 200 pounds. But man, it just goes to prove that if you set the goal and you work the plan, you can achieve it. And when you talk to this gentleman later on, he'll say, every single time I saw a pound drop off of that scale, I got more and more motivated. Every single time I saw another advancement towards my long-term goal, I got more excited about it. And what it turns out is the process is what really drives that motivation. And as I thought about this story, it reminded me of a recent book review that Will wrote for us. So this book review that Will wrote really got me excited, and I actually went out and I've read the book myself several times, and for some of you on this call, I've recommended it to you to read as well. But really, the review of the book summarized boils down to this. External motivation is great. Bringing in Afterburner to speak at your company's annual meeting is great. We are very motivational. We'll get people pumped up. We'll get them aligned. We'll teach them some stuff. But the key, if you want to sustain that motivation beyond just that one-day event, is the process, right? You've got to live the plan. You've got to have structure. You've got to have rigor. You've got to hold yourself and your team accountable to get there. And, that's just a brief overview. Will, do you mind telling us maybe a little bit more about the book and how impactful it is?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Finch. Yeah, this is one of the best books I've read in a long time because it dispels the myth, and that's in the title, the motivation myth, of motivation. And the point is fundamentally this, is many people think that they go out and get motivation. They go out and listen to a Tony Robbins speech and get motivation. Well, that's a little bit like eating candy and getting a sugar rush, is it can kind of push you in the right direction, but it doesn't last. Real motivation comes before planning and before execution. Motivation is something that is a product of the process of planning and execution. And what we mean by that is you go out and you plan to do something, you set up your process, and then you execute it the first day. And the execution of that and the success of that builds motivation to do it the second day. And that builds more motivation for the third day, and so on and so on and so forth. So motivation is a result. It isn't a prerequisite to success. And one of the things that Jeff Hayden, by the way, who is a ghostwriter that's written over 50 books for people he can't talk about, but he's also an editor for Inc. magazine and a very prolific writer. He's a great achiever, done a lot of things, and one of the simple things he did was he decided to do 100,000 push-ups in a year. Well, of course, he made his goal, and he rationed that down to he had to do 254 push-ups a day, every single day, and he did that every day. Sometimes he fell behind, he did more the next day. And the motivation that he got from executing that day after day helped him make his goal. But he knows and interviews a lot of famous people. It's an amazing list of people he knows. And some of the people that he's interviewed for this book and throughout the course of his career are people like Jerry Seinfeld, who is very much into the process of writing comedy. And he also interviewed people like Lance Armstrong, who is, of course, has won many awards and is one of the great athletes. So that probably sets it up, and I'll turn it back over to you, Finch.
Perfect. Yeah, because I want to talk about the Lance Armstrong story that Jeff talks about in his book. So we all know who Lance Armstrong is, right? One of the most highly decorated cyclists of all time. And, there's a lot of controversy about his win and the whole scandals. But here's the fact. The guy crossed the finish line in front of a lot of other people many different times, right? So he's been a champion many different times in his career. He's had a lot of success. But when Jeff actually did the interview, started talking to Lance Armstrong, it's interesting this quote came up. He said, this is what Lance said. He said, the one thing I truly loved about being a pro cyclist was the process. Not the accolades, not the money, and not the podium. I missed the process of getting to the point where you can stand on that top step. And I just think that goes right to it. You love the process to get there. That's that intrinsic value of accomplishing a goal that you set for yourself. And I want to leave you with one other quote. I'm not going to put it on the screen there, but I came across this yesterday when I was working with a client, and I thought it was just so wonderful and it fits so well that I want to share it with you. This is by Andy Rooney, the legendary Andy Rooney, right? He said, everyone wants to be on top of the mountain, but all the happiness and growth occurs while you are climbing, right? So it's the role, it's the process, it's that execution cycle that gets you motivated, and gets you excited, and gets you going to that next level. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This is Flawless Execution. We've just shown you a little bit of it today with the planning aspect of it. But there's a lot more to it, and we really appreciate you joining us. If you are using Flawless Execution right now in your work environment or as an individual, or if you just want to learn more about the methodology as a whole, we have a growing community called the Calling All Aces group. It's www.callingallaces.com. This is an online forum that you can go in, you can register, And you can share your experiences with people that are using the same methodology across many different organizations. I mean, we're talking fintech, manufacturing, food services, aviation, pretty much anything, software, IT development. We have representatives of foreign organizations that are using this process for almost everything. And you can talk about how well things are working. You can talk about where your struggles are. You can talk about ways that you want to improve, and you can solicit feedback from other people. So this is a really valuable resource. It's a great forum that I recommend you join. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Ms. Ansley Ankers and ask if there are any questions from the group for either myself or Will Ansley.
Thank you, Finch. And we do have a few questions here now. As a reminder, you can enter the questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. Our first question, how do you differentiate between perceived tasks and actual task saturation in a world where busy is seen as good?
Oh, man, that is a wonderful question. So whoever wrote that, thank you very much. I'm going to let Will chime in here in a second. Task saturation. We have worked with so many different companies where employees wear task saturation like a badge of honor. Literally, they brag to me when we first meet about how busy they are. They talk about, hey, I've got all these meetings, I've got all these phone calls, I've got all this stuff going on. I'm so busy. I've got all these different things I'm responsible for. Well, what they probably don't recognize is that as task saturation increases, and this has been proven by numerous studies, as that task saturation increases, execution errors are actually going to increase. And as task saturation increases, performance of the individual and the organization are actually going to decrease as well. So that's the first thing as a culture, as a society, that we need to start breaking down, is the fact that being busy is a good trait. It's absolutely not a good thing. And another book that I just finished reading, and I know Will read it not too long ago, is by Daniel Pink. It's called When, and it really talks about how when people start to get too busy or too overwhelmed, they're actually much less productive. And there's a lot of better ways that they can go about approaching it. So I believe the first half of the question was, how do you differentiate between the perceived and the actual? Well, probably the best way to recognize is we're all a little bit different. Some people are going to have actual things, and they're going to have a capability to handle more than other people. And some people are going to perceive that they're really busy, and they're going to put more stress on themselves and put themselves into an environment where they can work into a task-saturated state. Will, what do you want to add on to that? You're a lot smarter than me.
Well, I don't know about that, Vince, but yeah, I do want to make one more book recommendation, and that is the book Deep Work by Cal Newport. I just finished reading this. It's been out for a couple of years, but the point of it is to distinguish between shallow work and deep work. And shallow work are those simple tasks that you can do, and you can't necessarily multitask, but you can get a lot of that done and write an email here and take a phone call there. So that's fairly easy stuff. You need to segregate time and block it out for deep work, the work that requires your experience, knowledge, and creativity. And that's the mistake that people make. We talk about building courses of action in flawless execution planning. Make sure you understand the difference between shallow work and deep work. When you build those courses of action, you can better anticipate task saturation that way. And what you don't want to do is task saturate someone that must have time for deep work. So back over to you, Finch.
Thanks, Will. All right, Anthony, what do you got next?
How do you deal with unexpected issues mid-execution?
Okay, that's a great question. So we kind of had to gloss over that for sake of time. But when you get into the execution phase, you're going to find that there are going to be pop-up events, or there's going to be changes to your environment. And that's completely normal. That happens to everybody. Well, first off, it's very important that when you get into the execution cycle that you establish a strong execution rhythm, right? So an execution rhythm to me means we are going to talk about this topic. We're going to meet every week, Monday at 9 a.m. for 15 minutes. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to follow a structured process that we use it after, right? So maintain that execution rhythm. Well, while we're having those 15-minute meetings once a week to maintain that rhythm, the ACE, the leader of the team's job, is to identify when these pop-up threats or changes in the environment occur. And when they do occur, make that leadership decision if we need to pivot or change our course of action in order to achieve success. So, Will, what else do you want to add on to that? And maybe think about it more from an individual perspective as well.
No, I think you nailed it. I didn't really have anything additional to add without getting way down into the weeds on that.
Got it. I hope that answered your question. What else, Ansley?
What projects would benefit most from using this process on a personal planning level?
You know, I've had a chance to really think about this because we have used this personal flawless execution model before with a lot of success with different individuals, right? Obviously, physical fitness goals, this is just a shoe-in because you can build a plan and hold yourself accountable to it. But the other one that I've seen from a perspective of an individual is a financial goal, right? So maybe it's somebody that has too much debt, right? They want to get out of debt. Well, build a plan for how you're going to go out and you're going to achieve it. Or maybe you want to get to a certain point where you have X amount of dollars in your savings account, or you want to put away so much money in your IRA. Whatever it may be, you can set that destination out in front of you, and you can backwards plan for how to achieve it. You know, where do I need to cut spending back here? Where do I need to increase savings up here? And I'll pass it to you in a second, but the other one I can think of is from a professional development standpoint. And if somebody wants to, be a lifetime learner, right? And they want to improve their position organizationally or improve their opportunities at future organizations, they can build a plan for how to improve themselves in the professional world. And it might be as easy as saying, hey, I want to be enrolled at this MBA program by this date. How am I going to get there? How am I going to be able to afford it? How am I going to be able to pass all the appropriate tests to get there? You know, all the different steps that go into doing something like that. And then the other one is individual professional development. Even if you don't want to go out and get your follow-on degree or something, what if you just say, hey, you know what? I'm going to get really smart at this stuff Will and Finch are talking about. I'm going to email them, and I'm going to come up with a reading list, and I'm going to set a goal to read 40 books this year. What's kind of unique at Afterburner is at the beginning of the year, every year we start with a reading challenge, and everybody on our team commits to by the end of the year they will have read this many books about, professional development, individual goal setting, business knowledge, things along those lines. It's kind of cool. Will, what else do you think from an individual perspective this would be most successful at?
Well, at the risk of opening a can of worms, I'll do it anyway. But we also do workshops around the development of personal, professional HDDs. You know, whenever you develop a mission objective, it needs to be aligned to an HDD. The difference there, and why I call that a little bit of a can of worms for this call or this webinar, is that a professional HDD has a timeline somewhere on the realm of 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, and it is multi-dimensional. You can't frame a personal or professional HDD in terms of a single sentence mission objective. So it's a much bigger, much more strategic level, and there's a way you frame that, and it's something very valuable. We do this quite frequently in developing professional HDDs and career HDDs. So it's just something to think about. It's the point of it all is the flawless execution planning model can be anything for, like me, I'm learning to play guitar again, to someone's 2, 3, 4, 5 year long professional goals.
Andrew, what else?
Great, and we have time for one last question. Finch, should we have a red team look over our individual goal plans?
Yes. Oh, man, what a great question. I love it. Yes, 100%. You need a red team. So we skipped over this stuff intentionally for time. After you've developed your plan, we always like to use a red team resource. And thank you to whoever asked that question. You're awesome and you're my new favorite. But red teaming is where we invite in someone outside, but maybe somebody that's got a little bit of skin in the game or a little bit of a stake in the plan. In an organization, you want to invite in a subject matter expert. But invite them in and then brief them on your plan. You say, hey, here's my mission objective. Here's my threats, my resources. Here's my course of action. And then you just ask them to just tear it apart. tell me why my plan's going to fail, because I'd rather know where those failure points are now instead of waiting till I'm in the middle of the action. Actually, I'm trying to execute this. Now, when you're doing an individual goal, there's a couple of different resources that I would recommend as a red team resource. First off, I don't think you should use your spouse as a red team resource. And the reason is, if it's an individual thing, I would want to incorporate my spouse or partner into the actual plan itself, right? I would want them involved in the collaborative planning process because then we're aligned. We're going the same way. But you might want to invite in a different family member, or maybe one of your friends if it's something personal. If it's something professional development related or organizational goal that you're striving towards, invite in a mentor or invite in somebody that you have respect for within the organization and ask them to be your red team resource. Will, what do you think? And out of curiosity, who was your red team resource on your plan?
Oh, on my my Yellowstone plan?
Yep.
I didn't have one. You were the only person I had that I knew that had any expertise in that area.
I was your red team. That's right, I was your red team.
You were my red team and my lessons learned.
All right. Well, hey, everybody, that was a great question and a fantastic one to end on. I always love talking about red teams, so thank you so much for that. Hey, on behalf of myself and Will Duke, we call him Q, and Ansley Anchors, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's just a little bit about what we teach at Flawless Execution. We do a lot of great work with organizations, but like I said, I think it can really be applied to you as individuals as well. One last thing, if you haven't done this yet, I'm connected with a lot of you out there on LinkedIn. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always sharing information about what's going on at Afterburner, what's going on with some of the other clients that I work with. So a great opportunity to link in there. We hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Ansley, thanks for everything.